South Asia program of Cornell. The session is on social transition, and we are delighted to have Professor Beena Agarwal as our chair for the session. Professor Agarwal is a professor of development economics and environment at the Global Development Institute at the Leontief Prize and many others. Combining academic excellence with the policy advocacy, in 2005, she also led a successful civil society campaign for amending India's Hindu inheritance law to make it gender equal. So there is probably no one else more qualified to chair the session. Professor Agarwal, I hand it over to you. Thank you very much. Professor Agarwal, you have to unmute yourself.
Usually Indians talk too much. Okay, so thank you very much for that introduction. I want to first begin by congratulations to Bangladesh, to all the Bangladeshis and friends on this Golden Jubilee. And I'm really very deeply honored to be part of this very important conference, reflecting on Bangladesh's achievements these 50 years and the challenges it faces. So this panel will focus on the issue of social transitions, in particular human development, gender inequality, and the role of civil society in Bangladesh's development. And we have three very distinguished speakers and three equally distinguished discussants. So our first speaker, Dr. Salim Jahan, will focus on Bangladesh's achievements in human development, which has contributed to these achievements and the future challenges that the country faces. So both challenges that linger from the past, as he says, such as poverty and gender inequality, and those that are deepening, such as inequalities in climate change, as well as those that would be emerging under the pandemic and post-pandemic. Dr. Sahila Nazneen will then examine Bangladesh's gains in terms of gender equality in education, labor force participation, maternal mortality, and women's presence in public institutions. But gender inequalities also persist, especially in the control of resources and in violence against women. And she will ask the question, why do they persist and what can we do about it? And then Dr. Devapriya Bhattacharya will focus on civil society in Bangladesh, its historic genesis, its complexity, and its novel role, as we all know, after the country's independence in 1971. And the challenges facing civil society today because of growing restrictions. So with those words as background, let me briefly introduce our distinguished speakers and discussants, some of whom I have known and whose work I've admired for many years. Dr. Salim Jahan is an economist and former director of the Human Development Report Office, UNDP. And prior to that, he was director of UNDP's Poverty Reduction Division. And he's led UNDP's work on MDGs and SDGs. Before joining the UN in 1992, he taught economics at Dhaka University for 25 years. And he also served as advisor to the Bangladesh Planning Commission. He's, in addition, authored many books and papers, including on poverty, on hunger and deprivation. So he's a man of many parts. His paper will be discussed by Dr. Sabina Al-Kire, who directs the Oxford Poverty and Human Development Initiative at the Oxford Department of International Development at the University of Oxford. And Sabina is very well known, and she's done absolutely pioneering work with James Foster on measuring multidimensional poverty and well-being. Now, this global multidimensional poverty index has been applied to over 100 developing countries and has been adopted by many governments as well as the UNDP. Our second presenter, Dr. Sahila Nazneen, is a feminist political economist at the IDS Sussex, and she has written extensively on feminist movements, on gender and informal institutions, on women's empowerment and leadership, and on violence against women, both in South Asia and Sub-Saharan Africa. And I'll do a plug for her most recent book, Negotiating Gender Equity in the Global South, published by Routledge. Her paper will be discussed by Dr. Elora Shahabuddin, who is Professor of Transnational Asian Studies and faculty at the Center for the Study of Women, Gender and Sexuality at Rice University. And she has authored many books, including one on democracy, development, and Muslim women in Bangladesh, and more recently, A History of Muslim Women and the Global Politics of Feminism. And then we have our third presenter, Dr. Debapriya Bhattacharya. He's a macroeconomist and public policy analyst and a distinguished fellow at the Center for Policy Dialogue, of which he was also the first executive director. And he's currently a member of the UN Committee for Development Policy. He has been an ambassador and permanent representative of Bangladesh to the WTO. He's been on the board of UNCTAD. And so again, a man of many parts. His paper will be discussed by David Lewis, who is a professor of anthropology and development at the London School of Economics. And he has authored several books again, including Bangladesh, Politics, Economy, and Civil Society. So we have a very diverse and very talented group of and distinguished group of speakers and discussants. And with those words, let me hand it over to our first speaker, Dr. Selim Jalan. I might mention that every speaker gets 14 minutes, discussants get 7 minutes, and then the speaker can respond for about 4 minutes each. And then towards the end, there will be some time for me to try and highlight some points, and hopefully we'll have time for Q&A. So I hope I don't have the complicated task of keeping time myself. I have somebody who will do it for me. And so if there's an interruption, I'm not responsible. So over to you, Dr. Jahan.
Dr. Jahan, you need to unmute yourself.
Thank you, Veena. Let me start with 3 observations. First, 2021 is the golden jubilee year for the independence of Bangladesh. So the country and the nation are quite excited, and we take pride in what we have achieved over the past 50 years. Second, I think a 13-page paper can hardly contain or reflect the achievements of a country for 50 years. So some of the issues that have been reflected in the paper are the salient features of our journey over the past 50 years, but it does not capture the totality of it. And third, I will basically focus on 3 things. 1, what we have achieved during the past half a century. Second, what are the challenges as we look towards the next 50 years, and what can be done? What are the kind of the policy options that we have in order to enhance human development in Bangladesh? I think Bangladesh has quite an impressive journey in terms of human development over the past 50 years. Different indicators, different data would manifest that kind of a development miracle that we have achieved in the area of human development. A $35 billion economy in 1990 has become a $330 billion economy in 2019. The per capita income increase has been from $300 to more than $2,000. The poverty as measured by the national poverty line has declined from 58% in 1990 to 21% in 2019. If we look at extreme poverty, for example, then the reduction has been 43% in 1990 to 11% in 2019. So this is an impressive progress. And when we look at the progress, not only in terms of Bangladesh itself, but in the context of its neighbors, we can take pride in our achievements. Bangladesh now has a life expectancy at birth of 73 years as compared to 70 years in India and 67 years in Pakistan. The under 5 mortality rate in this country is about 21 per 1,000 live births as compared to 34 in India and 67 in Pakistan. So the achievements are impressive, but there are 2 issues with regard to this achievement that we have to focus on. One, all these achievements have not been even across socioeconomic groups, across gender, across regions of this country. In 2016, the top 10% of the country's population owned about 38% of country's income, and the bottom 40% owned only 13% of the country's income. So a huge gap in terms of the share of income by different groups. Second, when we look at the gender, the data are out there, but one particular thing that I would like to focus on is that the labor force participation rate of women is still about around 30%, while that of men is about 81%. When we look at the regions, district, southern district like Barisal has a literacy rate for people above 7 years, 75%, while that in Sylhet is about 60%. So the human development tide has raised boats, but not all boats, and not to the same extent. I think we should be mindful of the kind of the disparities in achievements of human development when we focus on this issue. The second thing is that the deprivations are still there. We can look around and see different areas where the deprivations are quite abound. For example, even though the country has been able to reduce the number of people in poverty by 28 million since 1990, there are 34 million people who are still in poverty. When we look at poverty from the multidimensional poverty index, we know that 1 in every 4 people are multidimensional poor. And the MPI for the rural areas is twice as that of MPI in urban areas. 1 in every 4 child are stunted, and 1 in every 5 children are actually underweight. So there are human development deprivations around different indicators as shown in this particular country. Now, what we have achieved, we have talked about it, and we have also indicated 2 issues which need to be looked at when we are talking about the achievements. But now let us move to the future and talk about the different kind of challenges that the country might face as we look to the next 50 years. I think in my mind, there are 3 sets of challenges, broader sets of challenges. One, what I call lingering challenges. One I call deepening challenges, and what I call emerging challenges. Poverty is a lingering challenge. We know it. I mean, it lingers from generation to generation. It lingers from decade to decade, and it continues, even though there has been reductions in poverty. But we know that lots of the people are in deprivations and in extreme deprivations. Over the years, Bangladesh has been able to extend the public services, social services, but the lack of quality of those services is a lingering challenge. Sometimes we have extended those services, but they are low quality, and the low quality services are provided to poor people. So as a result, I think poor people suffer on 2 fronts: lack of services and poor quality of services. And I think that is a lingering challenge as we move forward. The whole issue of employment of the younger people is a lingering challenge. We now have 30 million people who in the labor force, and 30% of them are without any kind of jobs. So I think to use the kind of the potentials and the capabilities of younger people, that would remain a kind of a lingering challenge for us, which we have to focus on. There are certain challenges which are deepening, and inequality is one of them. And there are different indicators for inequality, different data for inequality. And this is a challenge which has also been recognized by the Planning Commission. And when we talk about inequalities, I think it is important that we not only look at the inequalities of outcome, but also the inequalities in opportunities. And with COVID-19, with the kind of the dependence on information technology as far as education is concerned, the inequalities might even broadened as we move forward. In terms of the deepening challenges, I think the environment, the climate change, the challenges are deepening. As a result, there might be impacts on food security, food production. There will be challenges in terms of the work and the livelihoods of people. And I think there has to be a new rethinking about how we can combine the development and climate change together. One of the deepening challenges in the area of rule of law, the kind of what we call the transparency and accountability of public services. And this is something where the people of Bangladesh strongly feel that they are not getting the best out of these situations. And this is a challenge of public administration. This is a challenge of governance, which need to be looked at as we move forward. But this would haunt us, our development process, our development outcome, as well as the human development per se. The third thing is the emerging challenges, and we all know about it. The emerging challenge is very much talked about in the context of COVID-19. There are lots of studies which are basically alerting us that there may be further poverty and impoverishment of people in future. And there are different estimates of it, which range from 24 million additional people to 30 million additional people. This is not something where we have to have the last say now, or we can have the last say now, but definitely COVID-19 will have an impact on the living standard of people, livelihood of people, income of people, and overall human development. I think there is one or two other areas where we have to be mindful about emerging challenges, and that has to do with the social fabric and the society as a whole. I often think that there is an increase in self-centeredness of us. We are thinking more of us. We are thinking more of individual, each one of us. But history of Bangladesh, the emergence of Bangladesh, the kind of the society we have, what we have achieved, what we have faced together is kind of a collective approach. And I think because of the erosion of that collective approach, because of the over-concentration on self-centered approach, I think there is a erosion of, or there may be an erosion of social fabric as well as social cohesion. That worries me. The second thing that worries me a lot, somehow there has been an increase in the kind of violence and terror in the society. We always had differences of opinion. We always had some conflicts of ideas, but we have been tolerant of each other. We have been respectful of each other. We have provided dignity to each other. But increasingly in the society, there is an increase in violence on different fronts. There's an increase of terrorism, if I may use it, on different fronts. Somehow I think that violence has become our language and terror has become our culture. And this is something which would actually have had an impact on human development in Bangladesh, because this would have a negative impact on the democratic culture of the country and the democratic culture of the nation. We have to be thankful about this situation. The third thing that I worry a lot is about the inequalities, because as I said, the inequalities of opportunity.
Dr. Jahan, pardon me, you have 2 more minutes.
Sure. Inequalities of opportunities will have an impact on human development. Now, what can be done about all these things? And I think if I look at broader terms, there are clusters of things that need to be done. Some of them are traditional, some of them are going beyond the tradition. One is that in the traditional policy framework, there has to be a more coherent macroeconomic policies, which is pro-poor. We should have a growth strategy which would be a pro-poor growth strategy. There have to be investment and employment opportunities in those sectors where poor people live and poor people work. And that kind of a pro-poor policies, macroeconomic policies in the area of employment, in the area of fiscal areas would be needed. Second, I think in basic social services, yes, there has to be an expansion of it, but there needs to be a focus on qualities. And in terms of enhanced qualities, we have the traditional approaches of training and all kinds of things. But I think we have to go beyond the box and look at others, which have other nations, other countries, which have done a wonderful job in enhancing their qualities. And the South-South collaboration on this issue can really help us in those terms. Then the climate change. I think this is a kind of a concern that would haunt us in coming years. There needs to be a more multifaceted, multidimensional approach in that, where we have to combine advocacy and awareness with policies as well as with different kind of approaches. Now, there are other policy options which we have talked about in the paper, but because the time is short, I will not move to the conclusion. And in conclusion, I will say that as we look forward, we remember some of the words of the father of the nation, Bangabandhu Sheikh Mujibur Rahman, if I remember it correctly, and if my memory serves me right. While he was coming from the captivity in Pakistan to Bangladesh, he said that for him, this was a journey.
The time is up.
I'll take just 30 seconds. This is a journey from darkness to light, from captivity to freedom, and also from desolation to hope. For the next 50 years for Bangladesh, the journey would be from challenges to opportunities, from ideas to actions, and from deprivation to prosperity. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Jahan, and thank you for ending on those very important words of hope, because without hope, we will not act. So with those, let me pass straight away to Sabina Alkire, who's also an old friend. And hello, Sabina, and look forward to your comments.
Thank you so much. Hello, Bina. Salim Jahan's paper is truly a fulfilling read. With succinct eloquence and packed power, he articulates yet again the concept of human development, drawing on Amartya Sen's capability, purest language possible, then traces the contours of Bangladesh's accelerated path towards human development in 50 years. And this sketch of 5 decades uses rigorous available data, but weaves it together in ways that are at once educational and riveting. Not content to stay at the national level, his paper traipses to revealing comparisons across groups within Bangladesh, be it youth, women, or provinces, as well as with other countries. So all of us would be well advised to read and remember this piece as an apt summary. One point, one observation is simply on multidimensional poverty. Those data do not go back in time. Yet even in the years 2014 to 19, it might be worth noting that Bangladesh reduced the incidence of non-monetary poverty, according to the global MPI, by 14 percentage points, with 19 million people leaving poverty. This equated to a reduction of 42% in the value of the national MPI, the fastest relative reduction across South Asia. So maybe with scholars at CPD, we could take these numbers back further in time. But really, the freshness of this paper is how it identifies and articulates Bangladesh's lingering, deepening, and emerging challenges, and commends apt policies to confront these. A section that benefits from Salim's long gaze across history and does not shirk from hard talk. So just to refresh your memory, the lingering challenges include quality of services, youth issues, and women's voice and empowerment. Deepening issues are inequality, climate change, quality of governance. And emerging challenges range from COVID to women's voice and empowerment, where, as he puts it, cracks must be made in the glass ceiling so that once and for all, it can be broken. He also points out marginalization of people's participation, and he does not shirk from pointing out the spread of terror and violence, writing, as a result, human freedom has been limited, human dignity has been shattered, and human security is at risk. So what could one wish more of? Really, the paper is accurate, stirring, and forward-looking as it stands. Yet, like any exquisite yet tantalizing small meal, its memory is imprinted and leaves one wanting more. What I will nominate will be icing on the cake, but as they might articulate some new avenues for research and engagement across this wider community, I will articulate them. And really, they come into the left out dimensions of human development, the widening and deepening of prosperity on which he ended. Some are not new dimensions, but different articulations of the old. But the common feature are values. And values were key to the most recent Human Development Report in the legacy of Salim, the international study on the progress of societies and OECD's well-being work. And values include procedural aspects, such as rebuilding social movements, or rebuilding the spirit of voluntarism in public service, even while the employment sector recovers. But it also includes a deeper articulation of some of the dimensions of human development, a task that was beautifully done by the Quality of Life group in the Stiglitz-Sen-Fitoussi Commission, on which Bina Agarwal participated. So one is not just work and employment and youth work and STEM, but also work as a vocation, as service or self-expression that links to one's purpose and flourishing individually and in community. It might be under pressure with AI. How can we re-grab that understanding of work? Or moving to education, curriculum that not only obtains jobs, but also builds tolerance, not prejudice, lyrical souls, as well as mathematical minds. Another topic might be, who are the actors? The historical legacy was clearly written, but how can integrated policies going forward invite NGOs, private sector, and others to engage deeply in human development within companies, or by applying their work to new challenges? And finally, a few maybe new dimensions. In the wake of the COVID pandemic, psychological well-being has come to the fore, and that includes mental health, but it goes beyond it, to the art of happiness as a learned pathway, to harmony with nature and exercise, mindfulness, emotional intelligence at the school and the workplace, and ways that nurture the whole brain. The business community are entering into this, asking how that will make their jobs both more meaningful and more fulfilling. That might be a new angle of human development. Culture, whether it's music, dance, art, poetry, debate, ways of farming, traditional knowledge, creative industries, or the sacred and spiritual arts. Culture is a song, and its voice could be recognized. Relationships also came up in the pandemic, be it with immediate family, or on the market, or with colleagues, whether we missed them or were suffocated by them. COVID hit reset, and so how will the recovery engage and protect an intrinsic value for our relationships in person and online? And the last is time. How can we not go back to overwork, but skillfully craft leisure, build places of work, health, and education that stand and take their place alongside other worthy human endeavors? It could be thought that these are extras that could be undertaken after the many dimensions of poverty and human development are managed and the economy kicks into action. Yet it also might be that studies of human development to date have not paused to appreciate the innate and unusual skills in this regard that have existed across Bangladesh's last 50 years, cutting across social groups, institutions, and generations, and which, if nurtured, might have the potential to deepen human development sharply, even if existing potentials are only recognized and encouraged. So Salim's consummate paper invites the next generation to engage these complementary issues of deeper values of human development, going back in history and looking forward, but to do so without neglecting the lingering
the time is
and emerging challenges.
Yes, she's finishing.
So aptly painted with facts and imagination. Thank you so very much. 7 minutes and 2 seconds.
Oh, Sabina, thank you very much indeed for that really poetic set of remarks. And I do want to say that we as economists, and many of us are economists here, though thankfully not all of us, is that we need to look beyond figures. So just as we need to look beyond monetary measures of poverty and inequality, so we need to look at the more qualitative aspects of what makes for well-being. And I think what Sabina has so poetically put forward is the importance of the qualitative. And that qualitative exists not just in, it doesn't exist not just in what people say, but in the other aspects of culture. As you said, culture as song, the question of tolerance, the question of the issues of leisure, not just work. So we economists look at work, but what about what we do at leisure? Do women ever have leisure? So thank you for reminding us. We do need a new economics which provides the space beyond the figures. So with that, let me pass the baton to Dr. Sahila Nazneen from IDS, and she will talk especially on gender inequality.
Thank you so much, Bina, and it's such a pleasure to be a part of such an esteemed group here. Let me see if I can share my PowerPoint, and because it has some figures, and I'll talk about policy cases, so that might be useful to draw that out. Can you see it?
Yes, you need to maximize it.
Yes. So it's called, the paper is called Contentious Empowerment. And the reason why I call that is partly the story of achievements that has happened and gains on gender equality. We celebrate that. We talk about women's empowerment. But then there are also areas where we haven't gone so far, and there is persistent inequality, which will deepen further. So in terms of thinking through about women's empowerment and what has changed for women, there are lots of contentions around that. So mainly what I do in this paper is I cover very briefly what has changed for women in Bangladesh and why, but also what hasn't changed and how are women collectively organizing to make demands for change. Because when you're thinking about empowerment, it's partly also about collectively where you are and what kind of strength do you hold compared to other groups. And lastly, there's a little bit of reflection on whether the changes that have come so far or the challenges that we're facing, how would that affect kind of the sustainability of gains? So the main argument that I sort of put forward, and there are echoes of what Dr. Salim Jahan just said. Sort of in terms of gender equality, the progress in certain areas have been rapid, but it has definitely been uneven. The reason why you see sort of women's role sort of as a central role in development agenda, whether you're looking at policy discourses or you look at the national plans that are put forward, is partly historically, if you look at it, there has been elite consensus around what the agenda should be, and there's always been policy continuity once progressive policies have been put forward. So be that school stipend for girls, or if you think about the VGD programs, policies have continued. I mean, when you had change of power, it wasn't regressed. The other bit is, of course, what Niyaz Asadullah points out, that there were synergies in the areas where progress was made. So progress in health then has an impact on sort of what happens in terms of child education, etc., in terms of fertility rates. So the synergies help in terms of reinforcing each other. What also happened very early on in Bangladesh's history is the critical junctures, both the war and sort of the famine of 1974 sort of ruptured what is called the patriarchal bargain in terms of bringing sort of drawing the new state's attention that women are a constituency, that you need to address the needs, the older kind of bargains that men will provide and take care of poor women is not going to happen in that way. So if you trace sort of the gender equality policies that the state have put forward, these junctures do matter. in terms of contention, it's not that the story is smooth in terms of the state put forward policies or NGO programs didn't face sort of contention. It did, but it mainly came from rural patriarchy, not organized political forces as such in a big way, which then helped. And there were strategic accommodation of what kind of change you wanted. And obviously there was a role of what women's movement actors and leaders and policymakers played. But the key point here is it always happened within certain parameters. And what happens is that in terms of the challenges that we face and the inequalities that we will see is around the sticky social norms that doesn't change, male gatekeeping in terms of women's access to resources, policy spaces, etc., and then the wider economic and political shifts that we are facing that may pose a danger when we talk about can we sustain these gains. So just very quickly in terms of uneven nature of change and women's empowerment, Bangladesh started as at a lower base compared to other South Asian countries. You all know about the indicators here. I'll show you a lovely graph in terms of comparison. And this is from Naomi Hussein's recent paper. And I'm very grateful to her for doing this kind of chart. As you can see, Bangladesh doesn't do that badly. But there are unevenness of change. The challenges are around the areas of child marriage, adolescent pregnancy, violence against women, and then the precariousness of women's economic participation. There are other challenges also, but I picked these three, and there's a reason for that. So the reason is that I basically in this paper look at cases of women's struggles around policy reform in these areas and what has happened. And there's a lot of contention in an area where contention is happening. That sort of shows that that's an area that requires interest or focus on. So that's why I chose these particular struggles. They are drawn from studies that are still continuing. So obviously the data set is not completely complete. And I rely on both secondary documents and interviews. So what I explore in these cases, and I'll go through very rapidly, is what was the role of women, whether they are representatives, CSO leaders, or women policymakers inside the state. What were the critical junctures and where are the sticky norms? And then moving there to what are the possibilities for change. So let's look at ready-made garments. Female garment workers, the traditional narrative right now is they're the golden girls, right? The struggle for decent wage and work is a very long struggle. It's nothing new. Organized labor, it tends to be male dominated. That's also not surprising. Visibility of female leaders, as we say, are very few. And there's the issue about how much influence do they have? And also their connection with feminist or women's movement tends to be marginal. There's an issue about class-based politics here. But it's also the issue about what states picks up. So the Bangladeshi state has been contradictory in terms of what it pushes forward and what it doesn't. And there's been several occasions in the last 2 decades when this issue has flared up and there has been contention. And as you can see the years, one of them is, of course, Rana Plaza, which is 2013. And women are up against powerful veto players, both business actors and political elites. So what I'm saying is nothing new. But what is important to note is that the shifts have happened in terms of law or establishing of a minimum wage board, etc. What you see recently in terms of the shift of the 2018-2019 struggle and also during COVID pandemic is the visibility of women protesters and sort of women claiming a space at the table. But parallelly, what you also see is the space for dissent is shrinking. At a societal level, there is a recognition that this is an issue and there's widespread sort of sympathy. And there's recognition from the state because partly government wants to protect the Bangladesh brand. But how much of that would actually create a space where women's collective gain in voice would transfer into being able to make sustainable change or push for sustainable change is a question mark. And with COVID raising new challenges in the global economy, how do we sustain our advantages for one of the pathways that we talk about in terms of women's empowerment. From there, I'll move on to anti-domestic violence law reform and its implementation. The data will tell you that there are high levels of domestic violence in Bangladesh. Bangladesh Women's Movement formed a policy coalition, which is called the Citizens Initiative Against Domestic Violence in 2007. It worked closely with the Women's Ministry. The coalition was ready in terms of what kind of changes it wanted. It had quite close relations with the Women's Minister at that time and the current Prime Minister, and also the bureaucrats inside the ministry. There were particular critical junctures that created the opportunity to engage with the government and created pressure on the government to make the change. The outcome is a very well-crafted law, which had kind of organically evolved. There are gaps and loopholes in the law, which you had to have because you needed a law to pass, right? And there are certain patriarchal norms that would affect what kind of rights are you providing to women. The shifts is, of course, there's a wide-scale recognition of the issue and the different forms. There have been efforts to build capacity, and there is monitoring going on in terms of how the law is being implemented. Now, in terms of implementation, there's the usual capacity gaps in coordination, but there's also a lack of political interest in terms of implementing this law. And in terms of uptake of the law, there are sticky norms, as we know. For women, it's also about what's the alternative when you bring a case against your husband. There's also the issue about the attitude at the frontline level in terms of how this law is viewed and whether this issue matters. So you can see the issue about male gatekeeping and violence against women you do need to address, because if houses are not safe, then where do you go? Last struggle that I look at is the Child Marriage Restraint Act reform. As you all know, there are many push and pull factors for child marriage, starting from poverty to social norms to dowry, etc. The contention around the reform was about the age of consent, and then the way exception was made in terms of parental consent. So the age of consent was lowered. Exceptions were made if parents got permission from a court, they could marry off children who were younger. Critical actors in this matter, whereas in the domestic violence law, you saw connections with the women leaders in the state mattered in terms of how women's movement pushed this issue. In this case, those connections were not there. And this reform is happening much later in terms of time period than when domestic violence law reform happened. This issue, actually, the change in law took women's movement by surprise. In terms of basically the outcome of the policy here, I mean, the reform took into account the society's view on early marriage. The argument that was coming from the government is that, oh, there is a lot of teenage pregnancy, there would be premarital sex, you don't understand pressures on the parents, etc. And basically, we need to accommodate and have these exceptions. So while the time of the reform created wider debate, the reforms have already happened. You have 2 minutes. Sure. The change in law seems unlikely in terms of once these reforms are at place. So what the women's movement is doing is trying to refocus at the community level. But sticky norms are there around sexual purity and then sort of girls that get pregnant outside of marriage. So victim blaming, and what are the alternatives for the girls if you don't want to get married? So we are facing challenges. So this is just a table to give you a sense of how it plays out in terms of connection within the state, but also who were the veto players, whether they were strong or weak, and critical junctures. So in terms of conclusions, are we there yet? Reduce gender inequality and the challenges we face. No, we have managed first generation of challenges. Yes, women have gained visibility, public mobility in certain ways of having control over income, or perhaps we see them in political positions. But there's also been pushback because of sticky norms and also for the kinds of challenges, the second generation challenges that we are dealing with. COVID-19 will further deepen the issues, whether that's in terms of domestic violence rates going up or child marriage happening, or in terms of precarity of the economy, and then what happens to women. The struggles that we have seen, that shows us collective strength of women, but it also shows the limitations of that. So basically, the question is, what happens? How do we build inclusive coalitions? Or how do you go back to the consensus that we had on first generational challenges, or whether that's possible? And how do you bring about norm change? And that's a more longer term struggle. So yes, we have made some gains, but we have a long way to go. Thank you.
Thank you. Could you stop sharing? Yes. Thank you very much. Let me, that raises a whole range of very interesting questions, and I'm sure Dr. Laura will then comment on that and highlight those. Professor Laura.
Hi, thank you. So thank you, and thank you, Professor Agarwal, and many thanks to CPD and the South Asia program at Cornell and everyone on screen and behind the scenes for putting together this amazing conference. It's really an honor to be here, even so early in the morning. My task today is to comment on Dr. Sahila Nazneen's excellent paper in 7 minutes or less. And some of what I prepared, I realized, connects very neatly to earlier comments by both Bina and Sabina. So Dr. Nazneen asks, what has changed for Bangladeshi women since independence and why? How are women collectively organizing to resist counterforces? And are these gains sustainable? Focusing on 3 specific efforts by women activists to demand action from the state, she shows in very detailed and specific ways why and how some efforts were more successful than others, and what that means for what lies ahead. I really appreciated the granular descriptions of the 3 campaigns for change and have nothing to add here. I also have no quarrel with Dr. Nazneen's larger analysis. So what I'd like to do with my limited time is share a few of the issues that the paper raised for me and that Dr. Nazneen might want to consider when revising the paper for publication, or might be helpful to others working in this area. So first, I'd like to see a little more contextualization, both historical and transnational. The historical is important because it allows us to move beyond an exclusive and narrow focus on the nation state of Bangladesh. I recognize that some of this is the assignment given in this conference, but if we begin everything in 1971, we fail to pay attention to 1, efforts to target women in development projects before 1971 and before Esther Bosrup's classic 1970 book, Woman's Role in Economic Development, as well as 2, the longer history of women's activism in the region. You might want to consider, for example, recent scholarship on the Kumilla Academy, where projects targeting women began in the early 1960s. And many of these laid the foundation for the efforts in the aftermath of the 1971 war and the floods and famine that followed. On the activism front, too, women's activism dates back much longer, of course, and we should recognize that the activist efforts of the early 1970s also built on this longer legacy of women's activism in the colonial and Pakistan periods. I'm not suggesting you trace this history in this particular paper. You yourself, Sahila, and others have done this work elsewhere, but rather that even in a paper on the first 50 years of Bangladesh, it's important to acknowledge that Bangladesh's history didn't begin in 1971. Similarly, I think a transnational lens may be helpful because it situates the efforts of Bangladeshi development and women's rights activists amid global activist efforts to challenge ideas about gender in society and to improve women's lives. Just as Bangladesh's history didn't begin in 1971, neither did the country emerge, nor does it continue to operate in a vacuum. I absolutely agree with you that we don't want to reduce everything that happens in Bangladesh to international donor priorities and agendas. However, rather than see these changes as simply having been imposed from the outside and passively accepted in Bangladesh, which is not what you're doing and what you're arguing against, we could consider the exciting cross-fertilization of ideas that has happened over the years at the major international conferences of the late 20th century, the UN conferences on women, population, social development, as well as smaller, more focused gatherings within the global South. A transnational lens also decenters the state and bolsters your argument about the role of activists and civil society organizations alongside state actors in bringing about changes. So that was the first point, was about contextualization. Second set is, while it's indisputable that there have been many positive changes, as you pointed out, as reflected in the many statistics about school enrollment, women in parliament, etc., each of these figures warrants critical re-examination. So just to take one example, the constitutional provision for reserved seats for women has helped to ensure a minimum number of women in parliament. But feminist scholars and women's rights activists in Bangladesh have long complained that these top-down measures fail to take into consideration women's actual needs, that indirectly elected women MPs do not have the backing of a clear constituency, and many thus feel beholden to the predominantly male legislators who elected them. On a more positive note, of course, while women were invariably and exclusively used to be put in charge of only women's affairs or women's and children's affairs, more recently, women have also led agriculture, defense, energy, foreign affairs, education, etc. So that's certainly good. Finally, I very much appreciated your notions of first and second generation challenges and sticky social norms and veto players, and your attention to the different experiences of women of different class backgrounds. I think in Bangladesh, as around the world, it's become quite acceptable for women across classes to go to work. This has family and community support, usually, as you say, for pragmatic reasons. The additional income is too valuable to forego. What has been far slower to change, however, again in Bangladesh as elsewhere, are ideas about the gender division of labor in the home. So we have women coming home. 2 minutes. Thank you. So we have women coming home from paid employment, often more than one job, to do a second shift of housework at home, and then an additional shift as activists on a range of issues, and not simply so-called women's issues. So they've mobilized on environmental issues, road safety, etc., in recent years. This leaves little time for anything else, including leisure or personal development and growth. These problems are routinely left out of the impressive statistics, and I think there needs to be more work on this. Again, not necessarily by you or for this particular paper. We know that everywhere the pandemic has exacerbated all of these demands on women's time. But given the coincidence of the pandemic and Bangladesh's half-century milestone, I wonder if we might consider the pandemic as another critical juncture, similar to the others you mentioned, that has possibly offered new opportunities for women to work or organize or think about their lives and well-being, even if in less visible, less quantifiable ways. I'll stop here. I probably spoke too fast. It's really a wonderful paper and how it prompted new and interesting questions for me. And I look forward to seeing the final version. Thank you, Sahila.
Thank you very much. You spoke fast, but you spoke very clearly. And I couldn't help looking at the stunning backdrop you have, which expands our horizon hugely.
My campus.
I think Sahila, you might. We have allocated 4 minutes to a response. I wanted to reflect, if I may use a minute, on two things, taking off from what Elora has said. One is in terms of the history, that if you look back to the 1920s and 30s, when women's pre-independence, when we had united, India, among the early demands was women's rights in property. And I remember when I first visited Bangladesh in the early 80s and met so many of the women's groups, I was struck by the fact that they had documents where they were demanding that the constitution and not the Sharia should be the basis of property and inheritance law. I raise this because, in some of my own work, I find that beyond the law, which has protected women from domestic violence, at least, has been whether they own immovable property. I think you're very familiar with that. The second was that, under COVID, we're finding in India, for instance, that child marriage has increased hugely, especially in West Bengal. And you have, young girls are being sold off and so on. And we found the same during the Bangladesh famine in the 1940s. We found that girls and women became the victims of the complete decline of entitlements. So I wondered if you had any comments on that. You can hold them for later also, but you do have your 4 minutes for this.
Veena, after Sahila speaks for 4 minutes, can you please give Salim Jahan also 4 minutes?
I was going to say, but there were Sabina was basically had waxed so poetic on Salim's paper that I thought perhaps there was nothing contentious. But absolutely, we have to be absolutely even-minded. So even-handed. So let Sahila first speak, and then Dr. Jahan.
Thank you, Ilora and Veena, both for your comments, and Ilora particularly for your reflections. I'm relieved to know that you have nothing to add to the granular details. When you're writing a policy case, you always worry about what have you missed, and also when you're when you're pulling in different cases together that's still up from an ongoing research, you sort of worry that it's still not complete, which it isn't. In terms of just very quickly, I agree with your points, both in terms of historically contextualizing it and the transnational factors. So in terms of the policy case descriptions, like, for example, child marriage, obviously the original law is from 1924. And before that, it has a colonial kind of context in the way we debate and think about child marriage and how it got defined. So yes, history does matter. And of course, a lot of the changes that we see or reforms that we see or what is possible in terms of women's movements, collective strength, it's also about what issues came up, how it happened in the colonial context, and then in terms of post-colonial terms, what got translated. What I didn't go into detail, I touch it on in the paper, but not so much deeply, are the veto players. So I talk about the veto players, but if you think about the domestic violence law, I talk about why they weren't engaging at that point about the war crimes trial, right? But at the same time, like, what issues are contested by veto players also have a historical kind of context in that. So I totally agree with you on that point. And in terms of the transnational factor, yes, it does matter. I mean, what I was trying to do is not get so focused on sort of the gender and development discourse and the donor kind of influence, because that's how Bangladesh usually has been studied, that, things have happened in development because the donors wanted it, donor money was coming in. And there's much more to that than just what happened in terms of aid money. And even within sort of aid agencies, you had feminist movement actors who were part of sort of who you gave money to. And there were lots of negotiations that happened there that facilitated certain change processes. So yes, the transnational dimension is definitely important. And it pops up in some of the policy cases. So the Girls' Summit, that then leads the government to think through, we need to do this. Or the CSW review, that sort of prompts the government that we need to show that we have done something. So, and of course, the whole discourse borrows from international norms and sort of the conventions and everything that we have and the framing, while at the same time, you need to be careful about not to be branded as westernized. So yes, it's not just happening within the state. In terms of the care issues, yes, probably this paper, the policy cases that we look at is not necessarily the area, but it is huge issue in terms of how, if you're going to talk about gender equality, how do you leave that dimension out, particularly in terms of time poverty and how women get to engage, whether that's in the economy or even in politics. How do you do politics if you're trying to balance both home and outside? And is COVID a critical juncture? We had lots of debate last year on that. It is definitely emerging out to be, and it's about what kind of place do women have as a collective group in the policy space, but also as a social kind of constituency to push the agenda when agendas are being remade and policies are being shifted? And do we have a voice? And who's looking after and representing our interests? So that's definitely definitely something to see. And Bina, in terms of looking at
you have 30 seconds.
Sorry. Yes, inheritance law and reforming that would be a big issue. We always hit a problem around that. The last time we had family law reform was in 61. So, and its connection to domestic violence, yes, that is very, very well established. That's something we need to move the needle on. And we are still stuck on it.
Yeah, thank you very much. I think I would take transnational as both looking to the West, but also looking to South Asia, because the discussions around domestic violence with India, with Pakistan, Nepal, Sri Lanka, I think there are, all of us have laws, but we find that it's not just the implementation of laws, but much more structural, fundamental factors which matter. And we've all depended on legal change, as you know. So I would encourage us to also connect, and I'm sure you'll agree with that. That is across South Asia. So Dr. Salim Jahan, would you like to respond? Because I was amiss in not giving you the 4 minutes earlier.
That's fine, Bina. Actually, there have been 2 sets of questions by the participants, as I can see in the question and answer box there. First of all, my profound thanks to Sabina. I think she has picked up some of the salient features of the paper, but most importantly, she has also identified some areas where future research can go and should be taken by researchers and the academics. The 2 sets of questions that I can identify from the participants, one is on regional disparity. Someone mentioned that there is regional disparity in Bangladesh and how we can overcome it. And the second is about the violence, the democratic rules, the governance and all these issues, and how we can improve on that one. I think in terms of the regional disparity, there is a historical context to that. I mean, for example, lots of people would say that the North Bengal has been at a disadvantageous position historically there. In order to overcome regional disparities, one is the whole question of the policy framework. Are we taking policies to boost economic development, social development in particular regions, in particular districts? There can be more resources given to them. There can be policies which would help the investors, which would help the entrepreneurs from those regions to undertake different kind of enterprises. So there is a set of macroeconomic policies that we can undertake to overcome regional disparities, to boost certain regions. And in a way, if we take those kind of policies there, I think the regional disparities can be reduced. As I said, that it is historical, there's a long history to it, there's a long legacy to it. So it cannot be overcome in 1 day or 2. But if we can take policies to help the disadvantaged regions, backward regions, that can be overcome. In that context, there are also groups of people who are disadvantaged. I mean, people in certain districts in Bangladesh, for example, the people in the Chittagong Hill Tracts are at a position where they are not enjoying the same kind of opportunities vis-a-vis the rest of the country. So I think that should also be taken into consideration. Coming back to the issue of the democracy, the governance and all those things, I think we can approach it in 2 ways. One is, of course, the policy metrics. The policies can be undertaken to create the democratic space, to help the NGOs and the civil society, to stop violence, domestic violence, particularly, which has been raised by different participants, those kind of things. So there is a policy aspect to it. But there is also, I think, non-policy aspect to it. I think when we talk about democracy, it starts at home. It starts with individuals. Are we democratic in our individually, in terms of our approach, in terms of our thinking and all kinds of things? Are we democratic in the context of our families, in the context of our society? I think that kind of responsibility, individual responsibility, societal responsibility, family responsibility cannot be forgotten. And there has to be a kind of a creation of democratic culture there. And education plays a role to that. The kind of the values and the norms that we follow inside the families also play to that. It's a complex issue. I mean, it has to be combined with policies as well as the approaches, social approaches there. I see Taufik's face, so I know that my time is up. Thank you.
Thank you very much. That was very creatively used, that you picked up a question, a couple of questions. Thank you very much, Dr. Jahan. So let us move to the third presentation by Dr. Debapriya Bhattacharya, who again is, I would count as an old friend. We've met many long years ago, but hi, nice to see you. And I very much look forward to your presentation. He is a macroeconomist, as he says, but today he's talking about another estate, what Raghuram Rajan called, I think he called it the third estate or the fourth estate, and which is civil society. So look forward to hearing from you.
Thank you, Veena. This is one of the occasions when I'm very grateful that I'm speaking last in a session, because it allowed me to reach my office and not from talking from the car. So I enjoyed listening to all my predecessors in very scholarly interventions. I have a tricky subject. I'm talking about civil society, and civil society, its emergence, evolution, its challenges, the issues it faces, the agenda it looks at. And as I want to make a qualification that some of these issues has been observed by me as an active participant. So I speak less like a macroeconomist, more like a civil society activist over here. So the issue of, will you please maximize it for the screen? The issue over here is that the civil society, the concept itself is quite tricky, and defining it in the context of Bangladesh is even more difficult. In fact, in case of Bangladesh, finding an appropriate Bangla word for the civil society is even more challenging. Whatever word we use, it has a socio-political undertone, and the history of evolution of not only the civil society, but also its nomenclature has a long history. Quite often, civil society, in the paper, I have given the theoretical background, going back to Socrates, Plato, and Cicero, and how the civil society state and the political society were all synonymous at that point. And thereafter, in the age of enlightenment, how it has worked against the church and the kingdom. And then down the line, when we come to the Renaissance, and thereafter to the Marx, Hegel, and Gramsci, we see how this concept has evolved in a certain way. We have the Tocquevillian school and also the new Tocquevillian school, which had been broadly popular after the 1990s, and its new incarnation in the form of Robert Putnam, the social capital, and other things. The point I make on the theoretical section of the paper is that it is an evolving concept, and it had been very much history sensitive, contextually driven. So in case of civil society in a certain country, it can only have a generic definition, and it will be also acquire various kinds of attributes as we move forward. Let me come to the genesis of the civil society in Bangladesh. Quite often, the civil society in Bangladesh, some of the critics will consider it's an number section that it is supposed to be is a novel concept. It's an alien concept. It's the foreign-funded NGOs that really is all the civil society all about. I contest that particular interpretation, and I mentioned that the roots of the civil society of Bangladesh needs to be explored in the pre-independence period. The pre-independence period means it is the martyrs of the language movement, where the forebearers of Bangladesh civil society, the campaigners for Yukta Front, and even if you see the anti-communal violence manifestations during the 1964, the Purva Pakistan Rukhiya Darab. These are all the civil society people of the pre-Pakistan days. And the Ayub uprising and the killing of Professor Samsul Zoha of Rajshahi, I will consider him to be one of the best icons of the civil society of pre-independence Bangladesh. And during the time, we have seen how Awami League's 6-point movement received contribution from people like Rehman Soban, Nurul Islam, and others. These were the civil society working with the political elites at that time. So if you go into this pre-independence period, then you will see even in the independence movement, very directly, the civil societies were involved. They were armed combatant. They did political campaign, propaganda, cultural event, and also supporting supporting providing medical attention and everything. Ganeshastro Kendro, Dr. Zafrullah is a classic case in point. And the post-liberation civil society essentially carried forward the spirit of liberation and the autonomy movement and everything into the post-liberation movement. Now, if we go to the post-liberation the classification of civil society, how do you do that? The defining the civil society. I mentioned that the Bengali word, which is quite often used interchangeably, is the Nagorik Samaj and Sushil Samaj. I recall the 2006 when Center for Policy Dialogue under the aegis of the Nagorik Committee, and I see one of the members, Mr. Saidu Saman, present here, along with my chairman, is that we looked for an appropriate terminology. And as I mentioned in my paper, that Professor Anisuzzaman, Professor Abdullah Abu Said, they gave us various kinds of names, Jana Samaj, Puro Samaj, Attoja Samaj, various kinds of things. But at the end of the day, now we are using this Nagorik Samaj and Sushil Samaj. This is the interchangeably in many ways. But what do the other terminology which has come around is the NGOs, the Besharkari Unnayan Pratishthan, because the NGO word itself in Bengali, in literal translation, is not very good one in that way. So if you go around that during this time, we will see the Nagorik Samaj, and who exactly is the Nagorik Samaj in that way. I make the distinction between Nagorik and Nagorik Samaj, and the conversion of Nagorik to Nagorik Samaj. And I use marks over here, that how it becomes from class in itself to class for itself. And I gave the example of Professor Muzaffar Ahmed here, that when he stood in protest all by himself with a poster hanging from his neck, he became from Nagorik to Nagorik Samaj, because you are ready to stand up for your ideals and ready to take an element of risk in this event. So one would obviously create the question, those who at the middle of the night writing comments on the Facebook or elsewhere, are they really Nagorik Samaj? Are they really taking the risk or not? That is another, existential question we can talk about. But coming to the other forms of defining the civil society, please move. The forms and manifestation. We see that we have various kinds of records of the civil society. We do not have one comprehensive, adequate recording. They are registered in different kinds of ways, and you will see that 300,000 record. If you can all put them together, then it will show that the cooperatives are possibly the largest component. The economic cooperatives, financial cooperatives, and the social welfare clubs and other things would be the second largest component. The NGOs, the foreign funded NGOs, will be only 1% of it. But yet, let's move on. Yet, what I want to say, that those NGOs or the civil society organizations who are in civic activism, they are the public face of the civil society as it stands today. And you will see that their dimension, and I put in some numbers, that how the outstanding microcredit at this moment, 5.2% of the GDP. And if you look at the foreign funded NGOs, the foreign funds going is less than 4%, 0.4% of the GDP. So this is not exactly the right way of defining over here. So what is the right way of, there is no one right way, but in my right way, I bring in the three types of basic entities. The one entities which are pursuing economic and related objectives, And there we have two broad spectrum. One is the microcredit people, and the others are microcredits plus. And this is the Grameen versus BRAC approach you will see. But there are also those who are pursuing the economic objectives, those who don't do credit at all. And you will see that the Nijera Kori, the so-called radical NGOs, and I borrowed the term from David Lewis here, and entities who are pursuing social and environmental goals. And I mentioned some of them, those who are doing these things from Campi, Health Watch, BAPA and others, and then the entities who are pursuing democratic rights and human rights issues over there. And obviously CPD will fall there, but organizations like Sujon, Ain Shalish Kendro, Hindu Buddha Christian Oiko Parishad, all they will fall under that. What is important, that policy advocacy is an integral part of all three components. And there are overlapping modalities, overlapping activities, and it is not so clean and neat in these circumstances. But this is a classification you may like to use as a working definition. So what is the conclusions from here? First, these three distinct categories are distinct. They may not be so discrete in terms of work approaches. They have overlapping programmatic synergy. But the second, the two strands, that the microcredit and the social conscientization oriented, they also saw programmatic convergence over time in Bangladesh. And the third, for scaling up and enhancing their effectiveness, most of them as the organization opt for full-time professionals and partnership with the government. Now I will take you to the next phase, which essentially talks about how do you phase the evolution of civil society in Bangladesh. Let me get back again to my theoretical construct. Civil society has grown in relation to the state. It is a voluntary association of its citizens aspiring to achieve certain ideals, and they are getting into initiatives vis-a-vis the state to change the enabling environment, the policies and others. It is an intermediary between the citizens and the state. So in that case, how do you define from that perspective the evolution of civil society in Bangladesh? I make it four phases. The first one is the early years of independence, 71 to the assassination of Bangabandhu. And here we see the launch of night schools with the distribution of food during the famine. And this is the time when the civil society was essentially coming out of the liberation movement, was essentially fully aligned with the national reconstruction movement. And that is where we see BRAC coming in, Ganashastha Kendra coming in straight out of the freedom fight and into the there. What was interesting is that when the one-party state was declared, Bakshal was formed, many civic activists were quite confused and went into silence. And some of them really fell in line and joined the party. If you go forward, and we will see the second period. And the second period I call the period of disruptive democracy and the struggle against autocracy. And this is the peak point, as we will see later, I mentioned later, that the most antagonistic contestation of the state took place exactly in this period. And you will see that the two different political phases over here, the Ziaur Rahman's tenure and the Ershad's tenure. And I particularly mention here the Gramscian organic intellectual. And we have seen that kind of people. Shohid Tajul Islam, who was a communist or trade union organizer, educated from university, was killed in the
You have 2 minutes, sir.
Oh, I have 2 minutes. Okay, I will give away my right to respond and take that 4 minutes with them. That 4 minutes is foregone on my part. The relation between...
No, Dr. Devapriya, I use 2 minutes of that, please. So use 2 minutes now and 2 minutes later. Thank you. Okay,
so the second part is the disruptive democracy and struggle against autocracy. Move on, and then and this is the period we saw that how the civil society and the political society negotiated an exit for Ershad, and possibly one of the success stories. The next phase I talk about is essentially Agan, please. Is the rise and decline of the new democracy. The rise and decline of the new democracy is 1990 to 2014. Why 2014? It is the second election after this next election after 2008. I think when the civil society really disassociated from the new democracy political elites at that time. And we can see the highest point of competitive collaboration took place during 1995-96 to 2000. That is the period of Awami League at that time over there. Please go to the next one. And here, what we will see as the last one is what I call the last phase, and this is the running phase, living with the hybrid democracy. You know, the hybrid democracy between liberal and the flawed democracy, what we're talking about. Till the national election of 2014, there was a degree of openness on the part of the ruling elites to listening to the opinion of and suggestions from the civil society. I think subsequently it went into a conflictual situation as we see. Although during this part, we have also seen the Shahbag movement coming up, and even before we saw the Jahanara Imams, the Ganu Adalat and the 71 movement, anti-collaborative movements and other things over there. So if you see the hybrid democracy's current situation, and this is maybe my conclusion at this moment for these 2 minutes, whatever is left of it, is if you look at use the Freedom House Index for Bangladesh scores, and you will see how it has gone down, both for the political rights as well as within the political rights, the electoral process scoring, and also for the association and organizational rights, how it has gone down. The VDEM Liberal Democracy Index will also show the similar trend. That this trend is that after 2008 election, all the scores went up, and after 2013 onward, all the scores went down. The only aberration over here is the Economist Intelligence Unit's scoring, which went down up to 2014, but again it went up after 2018. Move me, please. So what is the status of the CSOs in the current circumstances? The CSOs, the point I make is that the health and livelihood of the CSOs are directly related to the democratic quality of the state of democratic quality of the country. And with the deterioration of the democratic quality, we see the CSO sustainability index is also gone down. And what is interesting, you will see that the advocacy capacity has gone down, and the legal environment has deteriorated for the CSOs and the civil society in particular. And what is important, the CSOs have lost a bit of a deterioration in the eyes of the people, because they are not really fulfilling their desired role. To conclude, the CSOs are at this moment under a illiberal democracy is adapting itself. I mentioned here the 4 major strategies the CSO, the civic activism is adopting over here. Either first, they're closing down. In India, we have seen the amnesty and Greenpeace has been thrown out, but in Bangladesh, we have national CSOs which has to close down, particularly because they ran out of money. The second is scaling down and scoping down, and it is also driven by the financial resource crisis, but they are all trying to leave below the radar screen and wait for some other time. The third approach is the diversification and innovation and creating partnership. That is how it does. And for example, many of us are using the SDG as a partnership coverage to move forward. And last but not the least is the co-option to get into the opportunistic approach towards using government policy. So what is the future? The future and the achievement. I make here 3 points. What are the 3 major achievements of the civil society of Bangladesh? My first, the last 50 years and before, upholding the spirit of liberation, not in terms of rhetorics, but in real terms, and ensuring the trial of the 71 collaborators. Number 2, efforts to restore and protect the democratic values and principles, including electoral rights. And 3, promoting the interests and concerns of the left behind people, inequality issue in particular. So what is happening in the world? The world as we see it, please take me to the last slide. We see at this moment, last slide, please. Please, next one. What we are seeing, that 4 main new trends which we are seeing. One is the social movement in the backdrop of the total, loss of, legitimacy of the traditional political actors are losing legitimacy, and social movements are gaining strength. Black Lives Matter was a perfect example of that. We are also seeing the social movement, youth are playing spearheading role. Look at Thailand, what is happening at this moment. Third, visible pushback from the part of the classes and communities. The farmers in India was the most recent example of that. And last but not the least, the civil society actors are getting directly involved in democratic transition. Look at Sudan, what is happening over there. My question to all of you is that, and to myself, what the posterity will say about Bangladesh civil society, given these current circumstances and the new possibilities which we see in the horizon. Thank you for being so generous with time. Thank you, Bina.
Thank you very much. Could you stop sharing, please, the screen?
Yes.
Thank you. That is such a rich paper, and obviously at the time you had doesn't do justice, but a good presentation also always means that you want to go back to the paper rather than answer all the questions in the presentation. So let me pass the baton to David for your comments on this paper.
Thank you very much, Bina, and thank you everybody for the opportunity to take part in this wonderful conference. It's really a great honor to be here. And thank you, Debapriya, for an excellent paper that I think makes new sense of this very difficult and slippery topic of civil society. It's a much needed overview of the civil society contribution to Bangladesh, which I think is a story, despite the vast amount of literature and work that's been produced on the subject, it's a story that still remains only partially told. So I think it's really important, as Debapriya has done, to take a distinctive historical contextualized perspective on the evolution of civil society. Just because it's an idea that within wider debates is often understood as one that's been primarily externally generated and imposed. People often talk about civil society in that way. And I think the story of civil society in Bangladesh is a really important counter-narrative to that tendency. And I was really struck in the presentation by the fact that the foreign fund receiving NGOs are just 1% of the total. So in terms of resources, it's negligent. I think it's also absolutely right to focus on the wide diversity of civil society organizations. It's often, it's too often thought about very narrowly, and there's a number of high-profile NGOs that often command the discussion, and we need to go much more widely. And I think the diversity of civil society is an indicator of the healthiness of civil society. There's still lots of gaps in our knowledge base, I think, and I was particularly interested by Debapriya's comments on the military period of the 70s and 80s. And I think there's much more work to be done to understand how civil society served to nurture and protect democratic values during that time, despite those efforts by various regimes to co-opt and control it. And I think there's a lot still to be understood about that time. I've got a few questions and a few comments on the paper. Perhaps the continuing humanitarian civil society response is worth commenting on. The outward-facing citizen response to the Rohingya crisis, for example, I think is a really striking manifestation of that civil society legacy and its activity in the present. I'd be interested to know more as well about which of the different theoretical perspectives that we heard about in the paper have the most explanatory value in the context of Bangladesh. I think there's always been a kind of paradox in the discourse of Bangladesh's vibrant civil society. That's always the term that you see applied to this. And clearly there's a really important contribution that civil society has made. But at the same time, civil society is strongly limited by elite interest groups, by forms of political repression, and of course by malign donor influences over the years as well. I guess one of the elephants in the room here is the relationship between civil society and political parties. And there's been research in other parts of the world, for example, Brazil, that shows that civil society groups have more chance to influence policy if they are connected with politics and with political parties. I think there's another area of the shrinking of civil society space that we heard about here that we should look at, which is that the shrinking of civil society space is not just a political and administrative phenomenon, it's also one that relates to the private sector. And the expansion of the private sector into civil society space, the kind of businessification of civil society through forms of corporate social responsibility, philanthropy, these kinds of things, I think is very much worthy of comment, especially in this current climate of seeing the private sector as a driver of developmental change. Although I think the Bangladesh civil society... Yeah, thank you. I think we could also mention the international dimensions of civil society and the influence. I think it's absolutely right to say that international forces have been much less influential in shaping the evolution of civil society in Bangladesh than they have in many other global South contexts. But that doesn't mean that they weren't there. And I think in the early histories, for example, of some of the more interesting NGOs like BRAC and Nijera Kori and Proshika, the international, interpersonal, solidaristic contacts were, I think, important. Okay, two more quick points. One is, I think, we do have to be very careful about the very positive view of civil society, and we have to be aware of uncivil society. And also, I wanted to just draw attention to Partha Chatterjee's work on the distinction between civil and political society, and the fact that many of the poorest people in Bangladesh live outside these worlds of formal civil society. Oops. Sorry, that was my timer. And then finally, I think it's always useful to think about the expressive and the instrumental dimensions of civil society. And I think they were both dealt with very well in the paper. And I think we can connect the expressive dimensions back to some of the discussion in the earlier part of the panel about the arts, about creativity, about values of tolerance. And I think we should certainly be bringing those much more strongly into our discussions of civil society. So in conclusion, I think this paper really moves forward our understanding in important ways, and I very much look forward to reading it in more detail. Thank you very much.
Thank you, David. Those were really excellent comments. I don't think we have time for a response unless you can do it in 1 minute. I did want to mention two very small points on this and ask a question that many of the right-wing, extreme right-wing organizations in India claim to be civil society. They are very uncivil, especially on social media. And the use of social media to actually, silence all that we saw was very positive in civil society in the 70s, 80s, and 90s. How does it play out in Bangladesh? And the second is, to what extent do you see the use of draconian laws, which were created in the colonial period, playing out to actually, again, people have been imprisoned or just trolled and so on. So that is another great silencer. And the question was, how is it playing out in Bangladesh? So you don't have much time to answer all the questions.
I don't think that I need to answer because I have used my time, and David is a good friend. I can always have a private chat with him and get more detailed comment while I finalize the paper. But to Bina, your two specific question, I would say, in the paper I have a section on what I call the alternative civil society, and where exactly these people have been mentioned. In case of Bangladesh, it will be the Hefazat Andolan, and they are the civil society outside the state, and they are really creating the new policy framework in certain ways on that. And on the harassments and other things on the civil society leaders, the most important issue at this moment is the Digital Security Act, which is really is a draconian act in Mende, subject to interpretation and very arbitrarily imposed. And that is also affecting the civil society and the media in many ways. In that way. So apart from the fund control on the part of the foreign funding and etc. over there. Thank you very much for David for those feedback. And Bina, thank you very much for giving me the space. Colleagues, thank you very much for listening.
Thank you to everybody for 3 really excellent presentations, very, very thoughtful discussions and comments, which have extended but also added to our understanding of the topics. Now we have, by my watch, about 15 to 17 minutes, leaving enough time before 8 o'clock Bangladeshi time. I'll use a little bit of that time to make some comments now, and then we'll have, perhaps we'll be able to take 2 or 3 questions. Some have been answered already, but I would encourage the speakers to look at the chat and the questions. As I said, I will be brief. I will not try and summarize what people have said. It's always a very bad idea to try and do that. But I will say a few things. Firstly, I should have said it at the start, that I've had a very long relationship with Bangladesh, with Bangladesh's activists, intellectuals. I first, I think, went there in the early 80s when I met Muhammad Yunus, Abed, Khushi Kabir, Nijera Kori, Prashika, and then in 85, spoke at the Dhaka University on my ongoing work on women and property. So I have a long and very emotional relationship with Bangladesh, and it's 50 years. So I would like to just restate that. And I do remember that this bindi which I wear, which is cultural, how many of my friends, including Khushi Kabir, put those on as a sign of resistance. There are 3 points I wanted to bring to the table now, is that, looking at the period post-COVID and what has happened in COVID, it seems to me that in some ways we are facing developmental reversals. So this is not only in the figures of extreme poverty that we see coming out, 78 million new additions, and there are various figures, but they're all fairly alarming. And what that means, because we have a very informal, very large sections of our society, of course Bangladesh is less so than in India, is the informal sector where people disappear. And to some extent, you go back to rural, you go back to agriculture. And one of the questions that arises is that to the extent that people still depend on farmers and the rural poor depend on forests and commons, the forests and commons are likely to also be affected because you have very little other resources to fall back on. So you could have a developmental reversals both in the kinds of decline in poverty that we saw earlier, but also in terms of environmental dependence on environmental resources. So I'm putting that out as a question because we need much more empirical work on that. But equally, I would say that we've seen also the issue of values had come up, that in the COVID period, one thing that strikes you are the stories of cooperation. Now, some of these are civil society cooperation in periods of hunger and lockdown, where both religious and non-religious groups came forward and communities came forward. But the more systematic, if you like, survival of organizations which were based on cooperation, and in particular, women's groups. So I've been, in the last 7-8 years, as Rahman knows, been working on small farmer cooperation. I call it group farming in a descriptive way to separate it from the old socialist, rather top-down collectives. And in Kerala and in Andhra Pradesh and in Eastern India, you have these large numbers of, in other regions, smaller numbers, in Kerala, very large numbers of all women group farmers. And one of the striking things, which I've also written about, was that last year during lockdown, in March of 2020 and April of 2020, some 30,000 all women's group farms, which were cultivating, they survived, 87% of them survived, whereas individual farmers did not. You also have many cases of self-help groups, which you find whether they were able to make masks, sanitizers, and so on, which survived. So so there are two elements here. One is these are the stories of prior to COVID cooperation, but they also provide us an alternative model of how we could move forward in terms of dealing with any developmental reversals, in terms of resilience, and in terms of building alternative livelihoods. The third issue for me is really that intellectually, and there's been many ideas today that have come forward, especially in Salim's paper, in Sabina's comments, and in all the comments in a way, and then there were prayers focused on civil society, that we need a new economics. And, and we need a new way of thinking about the economy. Now, there are many conversations globally which are happening. There are conversations around food systems. There are conversations about we shouldn't have the same kind of Lewinson model of, we expect people to transit from rural to urban, from villages to cities. We know they're unsustainable. And one of the most startling biblical images from India was the millions and millions of people who went back under lockdown and walked back hundreds of miles to get home. So many of these people, the women are not returning. They wouldn't like to come back to precarious existence in cities. So can we go back to the conversations of the 1930s and 1970s and so on, when we were talking of much more integrated forms of development, where rural and urban were not so divided, where cities and villages were, at least in terms of ideas, we were talking about much greater integration. But also the new economics, which is, yes, beyond GDP, yes, we know there's environmental degradation, but there are a lot of conversations about a flourishing economy, about an alternative economics. I'm part of a project. We have been looking at some of these ideas to put together, but I think that's something that we all need to think about and work on, to push back on the endless narrative of growth, because that's the basic figure which is monitored during the COVID period of what's happening to growth. Has the economy gone down? Has it gone up? And so on. And it doesn't broaden in the way that we know it should be broadening in terms of multidimensional indicators of what's happening. And of course, the final question is who would carry this forward? And here, I think the pushback by certain elements of civil society that the Priya talked about, and what they are pushing back is also other uncivil elements of so-called civil society, the draconian laws. And my question then is, therefore, that I make a distinction between agitational and cooperative collective action, that the farmers' movement, the agitations that social movements we're talking about, require to become much more structural in terms of everyday cooperation and institutional innovations. And that process needs to be much more inclusive of gender, of marginalized groups than it does, because in an agitation you sweep up and a lot of people join, especially women, and they become the forefront, but they don't become part of everyday decision making, even of so-called cooperative institutions. So even within cooperation, we need to talk about aspects of institution building and inclusion, and the values that people can bring to bear on this. So so I will end my comments here, and there is 5 more minutes, or 5 to 7 minutes, Ronak, where we can take a few questions. Is that for
yes,
5 minutes?
I have been here getting a lot of chats whether there would be any Q&A time. But I think what I request Tawfiq is to read out the questions.
So
I don't think there is time for answer, because we have to start our second session on time.
So yeah, so instead of
get a flavor of some of the questions.
Yeah, so I'm happy to do that, but shorten it rather than, because some of these are very long comments. And some comments have been answered. So, for instance, to Dr. Jahan, there was a question of regional disparity in poverty, which he has answered, but also this question of political challenges to widening inequalities and what are the solutions. And the question of social values and the decreasing tolerance of society. So those were some of the comments. To Dr. Nazneen, there was the issue of intergenerational mobility, Nazneen, Sahila, where they said that we don't see that, and is it class which is the barrier here in terms of women's income and education? And to Dr. Bhattacharya, there was particularly a question about the need to separate civil society and political society. It is something that David also mentioned. Is that something that you think is a useful distinction to make? And especially, there's also this issue of religious tensions in Bangladesh, which we've mentioned. So yes.
10 seconds.
Yes.
On the civil society and political society distinction, in fact, my whole paper builds on that. So yes. It draws on the Gramscian distinction between that, because Gramsci first made the distinction. And that's what I said, that the whole relationship, the evolution and their phasing is based on the contestation and competition between the civil society and the political society regarding the influence of the state. So I'm very much in it.
Thank you. So we need your paper.
So this is 7:50. So please give Sahila 1 minute. And
yes,
close this up. Thanks.
Yes, I will. Sahila and also also Salim needs for 1 minute each. We'll go backwards. So Sahila and then Salim.
Sure. Thank you. Very quickly, in terms of intergenerational mobility and being stuck, yes, there is a class dimension definitely there influencing that, and it's also about what's the alternative for poorer groups in terms of what are the chances for decent jobs and sort of the other issues that you face if you're going to think about how you move up. So what are the alternatives for women? And that's something to think about. And then there was a question in the chat box about the elite consensus on first generation challenges. And then does it exist for the second generation? The answer is no. We are fragmented. You've already heard about the organized challenge from alternative civil society groups. The space has shrunk in terms of what we can do. So in a way, what is needed, either it will be very technical solutions promoted by the state with space for dissent shrinking and you become more confrontational, and sort of the influence that you had in the 70s and 80s for the alternative NGOs and others to propose solutions and innovate, that's gone. The hope is sort of at the local level with COVID that you're seeing, and sort of a new way of at community level organizing and coming up with local solutions. Is that happening?
Thank you. And Dr. Salim, perhaps you could also talk about the new economics, if that's a possibility.
I think the
Only half a minute, please.
Ronak, don't keep interrupting. I'm very, very 1 minute only, but
okay.
Don't get anxious.
No, I think one of the new economics that you have referred to is basically focusing on people, going beyond the growth paradigm, and basically bringing in some of the human values of dignity, tolerance, and everything there. But the other aspect of the new economics, as I see it, is that in future, shocks of any kind would be a norm and rather than an exception. And shocks can come in different forms, whether it's COVID, whether it's economic shocks, whether it's other kinds of shocks. So the policy matrix will have to take into those things as shocks. We won't have a situation when everything is quote unquote normal. And I think in that particular context, the human development will also turns and twists, and the policymakers in Bangladesh will have to take them into account to build on what we have achieved, but also move it forward to meet new challenges. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Ronak, do you have 30, can I give 30 seconds to you and Rahman?
No, I think there is no need for Rahman. I would like to thank you, Bina, for chairing this session. Great to have you. And I would like to thank all the paper presenters and discussants. My apologies because of time differences that people are joining in. And in the next session, we have 4 presentations with a lot of slides on art and architecture, which needs time. So my apologies, but we thank everybody. And Bina, you can now declare to close the session.
Yes.
And my apologies to you, and thank you very much.
No. Well, thank you very much for inviting me. And it's wonderful to meet old friends and make new ones. And let us all stay connected. Namaste.
Okay. Bye.
Bye. Bye. Thank you.
Thank you.
Recording stopped.